Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Election Matters 2020, hosted by Powell Tate. I'm Jack Leslie, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator for this, the second session of our four-part webinar series designed to help you and your organizations navigate the U.S. elections. Powell Tate is a public affairs division of Weber Shandwick, founded by Powell Tate, Press Secretary to President Jimmy Carter, and Jody Powell, Press Secretary to President Jimmy Carter, and Sheila Tate, Press Secretary to First Lady Nancy Reagan. Powell Tate has a deep bipartisan tradition. That commitment to political diversity results in a team that understands fast-changing politics, complex policy debates, and emerging cultural trends. And in this series, we're exploring some of those issues with notable figures in politics, advocacy, and the media as our guests. We'll discuss how this election is different, the issues at play, what to watch, and what comes next. As all of you know, we're living through extraordinary times with serious divisions in our body politic. We'll seek to ensure our conversations are always civil and respectful, and even when presenting differing or controversial points of view. And importantly, the candidates and opinions discussed are not endorsed by Powell Tate or Weber Shandwick. In today's session, we'll talk with the leaders of two of the most impactful advocacy organizations engaged on the challenging issues confronting our society, Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League and Marc Morial of the National Urban League. Jonathan is the CEO and the sixth national president of the Anti-Defamation League, the leading anti-hate organization committed to fighting defamation of the Jewish people and to securing justice and fair treatment for all. Before joining ADL in 2015, he served in the White House as Special Assistant to President Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation. And before that, Jonathan had a long career co-founding Ethos Brands, as you can see over his right shoulder there when I first met him, later acquired by Starbucks, and founding All for Good, the largest database of volunteer opportunities on the internet incubated at Google. And since 2003, Marc has been the CEO of the National Urban League, the 110-year-old civil rights organization dedicated to economic empowerment, equality, and social justice. He's transformed this historic organization, expanding its reach and creating a policy framework to effectively serve communities of color. Before joining the Urban League, Marc served as mayor of New Orleans for 2 terms, leading the city to a renaissance and leaving office with an extraordinary 70% approval rating. He served as a Louisiana state senator, president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and a member of a number of presidential commissions. So Jonathan and Marc, thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having us. Good morning.
You are indeed two of the most important national civil rights leaders that we have right now, and we're just delighted you're here. We've all three of us have been through an awful lot of elections in our time, but I don't know about you, but I don't remember anyone quite like this. Last night, the president tested positive for COVID-19, and I think I speak for all of us, no matter what your politics are, we wish the president and the first lady a speedy recovery. Both of you, by the way, wrote a op-ed last spring about how this pandemic has really exacerbated the structural racial inequities in our society. How do you think the candidates and elected officials are addressing these issues since then? How is it playing out in this election? Maybe we'll start, Marc, with you.
Yeah, well, let me thank you for this discussion this morning. Certainly thank Powell Tate and Weber Shandwick and you. Also thank my good friend and ally in this work, Jonathan Greenblatt, who has just brought a tremendous amount of energy and foresight and passion to the work of ADL and to the overall civil rights community. So we have to look at what we see in the headlines and then the work that takes place sometimes in the headlines, but not always in the headlines. So I think that there's been a concerted effort by many to respond to this moment and to respond to COVID through multiple pieces of legislation, COVID relief legislation called the CARES Act or stimulus bills. I do not think that any of them have completely or effectively addressed the nature of COVID when we talk about its health disparities. So the COVID pandemic has exposed in a way so clear and unambiguous those health disparities. And why do I say clear and unambiguous? Because of the deaths, the number of deaths and the disproportionality of the people who have died, underscoring the fact that now we see with President Trump that no one is beyond the reach of this awful pandemic. Not even the most powerful person in the country is beyond the reach of this pandemic. So this pandemic affects and can affect everyone. But when it comes to Blacks and Latinx and Native Americans, the death rates and the contraction rates have been disproportionate to the numbers in the population. And that issue has not been fully addressed because that issue is one of a long-standing nature. The economic disparities and the racial justice disparities, they're works in progress. So there are many, many people, even many people in the Congress, who've worked, and many governors and mayors and private sector players and philanthropists who work to respond, to the disproportionality that COVID has exposed. But so much more is needed. And I know we'll talk more about that today. So that's my sort of initial take on where we are.
Yeah. Jonathan, what's yours?
Well, look, I think my good friend Marc Morial unsurprisingly gets it right. I think it's very germane and timely to talk about the fact that when the President of the United States of America, who's got a staff around him of experts, who's got a team of people, tending to his every need, and he is more in the bubble than anyone else, when he contracts it, let alone his wife, other people on staff. I just learned this morning that the chairwoman of the GOP has also been diagnosed with COVID. It should send a warning sign to everyone. And then we shouldn't be surprised that unlike the president, our commander-in-chief, those who are most vulnerable, those who are most marginalized, those who have the least access to resources are some of the most exposed. And if you look at the death rates here in New York City or around the country, this is hitting home. I heard the stat the other day, Mark, that I think it's one out of, maybe it was Vice President Biden who quoted this in the debate, that 1 out of 1,000 Black men will die of COVID this year. I mean, it is extraordinary. More people have died of this condition than in all of the wars of all the wars of the 20th century combined. And again, this kind of health crisis creates economic impacts. And those who are already on the edge, those who are already on the scene, we shouldn't be surprised when this literally pushes them over the edge. What's so disappointing, Jack and Mark, is Congress's inability, like just last week, to pull together the right legislation to give people the aid that they need. And I will say one other thing, and this isn't intended to be political, but thank God for the ACA and Obamacare. Because what would we do if we had more of these people, right, who didn't have insurance? No. Again, just so we're clear, and I don't really care how people vote, I care what they value. And the notion that you'd have people, again, who are already at such risk, without the service that they need, would be more people dying, more people coming in without the right coverage. And not only, again, the impacts on them are incalculable. The rest of society ends up paying for it anyways. So I think this just underscores the need for comprehensive policy strategies and a compassionate perspective on those who have the most need.
Yeah. The pandemic, obviously, too, is, I want to ask you, because you both your organizations have collaborated on something that involves voter turnout. And given this pandemic, that too is getting a lot of well-deserved attention, the validity of mail-in ballots and so forth. Your organization's partnered on the Our Time, Our Vote voting rights project, which I know is especially designed to encourage younger voter turnout and engagement in the political process. What tell us a little bit about that, which brought your organizations together. And I'll tell you, I have to, not that I'm a cynic, but I remember back our firm helped MTV with Rock the Vote, and we've been talking about Youth Vote for a long time. And every year I'm kind of disappointed. I remind my own kids who are voting age, I know they'll be out there, but I'm sometimes a bit disappointed on the Youth Vote. You think we're going to see something different this time? And tell us about Mark, we'll begin with you. And
let me let Jonathan frame it up because, in many respects.
Sure.
Jonathan.
So I mean, look, I think it's interesting when you talk about ADL and Urban League coming together. Even though Mark and I are good friends and active colleagues today, our organizations have been on the forefront of the fight for civil rights, of the fight for social justice, of the fight for equal treatment for 100 years. So Mark and I are kind of stewards of this work today, but it stretches back way before the two of us were even born. That being said, what we're doing now is I think this election is clearly so pivotal, and voter turnout is a perennial problem, Jack, as you kind of allude to, particularly with young people. But we think there's an opportunity and a need right now to call attention to how our communities have a shared stake in this election. All Americans do, but particularly from minorities who, again, have had to deal with, a president who can't call out the Proud Boys, for God's sake, in a presidential debate. Black folk who have been, again, murdered in the streets of our cities over the course of the summer and long before. And so we have again, so many shared interests. The idea was, how do we bring the next generation of our leaders together to work hand in hand, arm in arm, on this issue of making sure that everybody is focusing on this election? Because we know, I mean, we're dealing with cases across the country, voter suppression right now. We're dealing with one candidate who's trying to, what's the word, like call into question the integrity of the election before it even happens, trying to create the groundwork to suggest it's all a fraud. So it's never mattered more for people to show up. And if the Urban League and ADL can do this together, we're starting in Philadelphia, we're looking at other cities. I hope it will be a model, not just for our two organizations, but for many others, to again energize and drive the next generation to get out there and show up in an election where it's probably never mattered more.
Jack, there's an awakening in America amongst the emerging generation, those in their 20s and those in their 30s. That awakening has been compelled by, the era of Trump. That awakening was accelerated when we saw the response to George Floyd, where we had people in the streets, many young people in the streets of all backgrounds, races, colors, creeds, and religions. It was a beautiful thing to see the spontaneity of that coming together. And that spontaneity of coming together, I think Jonathan and I, I think it really came together around this vision of tomorrow and this vision of the future. And this idea that the young leaders in ADL, young leaders in the National Urban League needed to more formally work on an initiative, more formally work on something that was animating their passion, which is voting and democracy and the protection of it. And mindful of the fact that we've lived in this unfortunate era of this rise and spike in hate crimes, directed at Jewish Americans, directed at African Americans, directed at Latinx, directed at Asian Americans, directed at Muslim Americans, directed at LGBTQ Americans. This rise in hate crimes, and the idea is, as a response to it, is to vote and to encourage people to vote their values, vote what they believe in. Yeah. Vote for those that align with their vision, which is really an America without this hatred, without this intolerance, without this racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and all of these divisive, if you will, tendencies that we can't survive as a nation. And so our young people, in this time, our young people are going to lead the way. They're going to give all of us energy and a sense of fight and passion, but they're architecting the future nation that they want to live in. And that's why I think we see what we're doing together as just the start of something that can be bigger and that can continue to grow. But it starts because young people in ADL and young people in the National Urban League, they're predisposed. They've already made a choice to be active participants and active citizens and people who stand up for opportunity and justice.
Yeah, that's so important. Let's explore that a little bit more. I think I've talked to both of you in the past about this, but you know, I likened it to 1968. You know, when we lost two icons in the fight for justice and civil rights, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And there was violence in American cities and a war raging overseas. And this year we lost icons like John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Larry Kramer, the landmark AIDS rights activist. So we're going through this, another real national reckoning on racism and hatred in America, as you just talked about, Mark. And I'm glad to hear that. I think I agree with you that young people can help, but at the end, how are we going to bridge this divide? And is it your hope that after November we're able to start to see that?
I'll offer my thoughts. I feel I'm eternally hopeful that, and I truly believe that if large numbers of Americans vote in this election, if we have a record voter turnout, if we have a strong amplification, I feel that arc of that participation is going to bend towards a change in direction in the country. I truly believe so. But I think we have to be smart and realize that even as elections have consequences and create direction, that this grassroots, this community-based, this effort by individuals and organizations that we're a part of, Jonathan and I and our organization are part, has to continue. We can't retreat to the grandstands and say, well, we've now voted and we like the way it's come out, and therefore we'll retreat to the grandstands and we'll watch. We have a huge task ahead of us to rebuild this country. We're being ravaged by COVID, the deaths, the layoffs, the economic pain. We are the future for the economy is uncertain, particularly for small businesses. Some industries like airlines and hotels are fighting to survive, and all of the people they impact and affect. The racial justice front is aggravated, even as we watched with horror during this recent debate and the failure to condemn white supremacy when it was just laid out there in front of millions of people. The words wouldn't even come. The words wouldn't even come. And the words being a window to the heart and the soul and the constitution of people. So I think we're going to have so much work to do that it's going to be a generation of work to rebuild, a generation of efforts and energy and people and organizing to rebuild the future of this country. So I'm optimistic. Is it 68? Is it 29? Is it 19, 18, and 19? What kind of year is it? 68, post 68, we had the rise of Richard Nixon and George Wallace.
Yeah. Yeah. Jonathan, I saw your hand go up there.
Yeah. This has been a very tough summer. and a very tough year. We lost so many giants this year. We lost Congressman Lewis, like just on the civil rights side, we lost Congressman Lewis, and we lost Reverend Joseph Lowry and C.T. Vivian, who are giants of the movement and work with Dr. King and so many others, and the congressman. We lost icons like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and in the Jewish community like Kirk Douglas.
Yeah. We
lost, like you said, Larry Kramer and Phyllis Lyon, who was a giant and an activist as well in the LGBTQ side. And we lost, people who had a cultural resonance, like who you could reduce to one word, like Kobe and T'Challa, right? Like this has been hard. But I think where Mark was just going is right. I don't know if we really have a parallel. 68 is real, but just think about it, Jack. In this year alone, we've had this global health pandemic, which has literally halted the entire world economy, right? And again, claimed more lives than anything since 1918, Spanish flu. Secondly, we've had this economic slowdown of massive proportions. Thirdly, again, the moment of racial reckoning, post the bookended, if you will, just not just the killing of George Floyd, but by the exoneration of the officers who shot Breonna Taylor in cold blood last week by a grand jury. So you've had this moment of racial reckoning with violence on the streets. Oh, and then you've had cataclysmic weather events, including these fires that have ravaged the West Coast.
Yeah.
And all this is taking place against the backdrop of, this rise in hate crimes that Mark talked about. At ADL, we track this information. In 2019, the ADL marked more hate crime, more anti-Jewish hate crimes than we've seen in 40 years, a record high. Okay, and then again, on the other side, we literally had the president 2 nights ago talking about the Proud Boys in one breath and then poll watching in the other. And if you haven't looked at the latest issue of The Atlantic, it's got a long article on a group called Oath Keepers that we watch at ADL. They're one of these armed militia groups who are typically former military and law enforcement, who are planning on going to the polls and quote unquote poll watching, which historically has been a strategy to intimidate, minority voters and the uneducated and suppress people. So this is, 68 feels resonant in some ways, and in other ways, this feels like it almost has no precedent. But the only way that we work through this, I think, Jack, again, is when we come together. I think, yes, civil rights leaders have a role to play, and ordinary citizens have an ability to have an impact. And corporate executives and business leaders can step up. At ADL, we every year do the largest annual conference on anti-Semitism and hate, and we give it an award every year to a CEO who has made a difference on these kinds of issues. For example, Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, was awarded a couple of years ago, 2 years ago maybe, for his work with the LGBTQ community. And then last year, Hamdi Ulukaya, who's an amazing entrepreneur. He's the CEO of Chobani, right? He's a Kurdish Muslim from Turkey who immigrated to the United States, who's done amazing work with refugees, who's done remarkable kind of effort bringing jobs home and supporting his own people and employing immigrants, amazing stuff. This year, we're recognizing Ken Frazier from Merck, the African-American CEO who stepped off of that business advisory board after the Unite the Right rally. So I just want to say this because I'm also coming off of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign this summer, right? Where we had over 1,000 businesses step up and say, we're going to get off of Facebook to protest the way that they continue to facilitate extremism and hate on their platform, racism and anti-Semitism and all of it. So in this moment, whatever the historical parallel, whatever you think is the antecedent, I think we should be reminded more than ever in this democracy, from ordinary citizens to elected officials, from business leaders to kind of civil rights activists, from people of faith, right, to people in other parts of civic society, everybody can play a part in trying to turn this around.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, I'm glad you're.
I'm back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you're back. And I'm going to come back, Jonathan, because I want to talk more about social media and how that affects particularly hate speech. But since Marc is back, I had a question for you, Marc. You know, there's a reason I think you had a 70% approval rating in New Orleans. And, you know, New Orleans went through, there's been a lot. It's interesting, Ken Frazier, you know, is getting your award this year, Jonathan, because we all remember Ken having come out immediately after Charlottesville and really being
took a lot of courage.
Business person to condemn that. But of course, one of the issues, Marc, I wanted to ask you about what we could learn from New Orleans and from your experience there. You know, that city also went through the removal of the Confederate statues that have been such a flashpoint at various stages in this campaign as well. Talk a little bit about the process that you went through. I think there are some lessons that, you know, that can be learned that go back to your point earlier, how we begin to bridge some of these.
Yeah. So, you know, the move to remove the statues just were undertaken by Mitch Landrieu, who was a great mayor of New Orleans, whose term ended about 2 years ago.
And gave a great speech on this topic, by the way, which
and
Google and better speech.
My work in New Orleans to try to build a coalition was premised on the notion that people were not going to agree about everything. And it was premised on building coalitions around very specific initiatives, whether it was a public safety initiative that was comprehensive in investing in youth and strengthening our police department and embracing community policing, whether it was housing initiatives that incorporated a role for the private sector, but didn't let real estate developers have free reign, balance it with community interest in governmental interventions. It was really about saying to people, okay, we can't get in a room and agree on a comprehensive plan, but we can agree on this, or we can agree on this. So why don't we work on this? And if we can separate out that we're going to fight on some other things, and we're going to disagree on some other things, and we may not be voting for the same people in national elections, maybe we can make some things happen for our city. Now, you know, at the municipal level, you don't have the same level of partisanship, but you do have factionalism and interest groups and community friction, I would call it. So I really tried to get people to focus on specific initiatives. And by doing that, we built some pretty impressive coalitions around housing, around public safety, et cetera. We found ways that we could work together on with respect to the Louisiana legislature. That was so it's a way of trying to do business, but it also means that when I reserve for myself the right to disagree even with people in a coalition, or to lead notwithstanding opposition within the coalition if it was necessary. One of the things it was predicated on was trying to create dialogue and community participation at a table, and giving people a true sense of not just the appearance of being heard, but the sense of being heard. And then having a little bit of a tolerance and an appetite, because this is New Orleans and this is municipal politics. You know, I always said, if in New Orleans, if you had, you know, a community conversation going and somebody didn't get animated and fired up, then it wasn't a New Orleans conversation. And, you know, you sort of said, okay, people are going to come and there's going to be some pushing and shoving, but let's let everybody get their point of view out here, right? Let's let everybody have their say. And then ultimately, and there were some times when I sought to build consensus around an issue and didn't get it. And I said, guys, if you can't agree, I will decide. And it's my prerogative as a mayor to decide. And everybody might hate it. 2 of you all might like it, and 5 of you all may hate it. I said, but I'll make a decision. if you can't find consensus, I'm not going to sit there and say, because we can't find consensus, we're stalled out. We can't do anything. So, I always wonder, sometimes at the national level, the structure of national politics is red shirts, blue shirts. It's predicated on a lot of, kind of division. I also think that within neither political party in the United States is a monolith anymore, in truth and in fact, even though they might operate monolithically in the Congress, because that's the way the Congress is designed. The Congress is designed around a majority and a minority. And if the American people don't like it, they'd have to make radical shifts in how the Congress is set up or the Congress is arranged.
Yeah. Well, let's go explore that a little bit. And maybe, Jonathan, let's get back to the social media thing, because I think all of us have talked about a concern that we have that politics today is the dynamic of it really is driven much more by identity and sort of cultural affinities than it is by ideology or even party. And much of that, I think it's due to a lot of things, and we can try to unpack this, but Jonathan, you've talked extensively about the role of social media in this, in driving people, because of oftentimes the way the algorithms are written, driving people to the extremes. And you're monitoring that. ADL probably monitors certainly what's going on in social media, at least with respect to hate speech and hate groups, more than anybody else. You're the expert. Talk to us a little bit about that process and what it's done more broadly to the body politic and sort of civil discourse.
Yeah, I guess so. A couple things. So first of all, I don't know if I agree with the premise. I mean, you definitely see today more attention to identity politics than we've had in recent memory. In some ways, I think there is value, though, to folks kind of lifting up these issues of diversity and equity, which for too long I don't think were, acknowledged or appreciated in the policy environment. Now, like anything else, well, at least this is my view, I think all things in moderation, right? So too much of anything is probably just flat out too much. To that end, I think identity alone can't be the basis for policy, but it's a critical part of understanding how we create, again, a more just and equitable society. But I still see lots of ideology. I think if we look at, the recent Supreme Court justice nomination, that is ideology driving that, not kind of identity politics, trying to get someone on there who aligns with a particular worldview, which you may or may not agree with, but I do think you've got ideology. What I will say that is also new today that we haven't had in the past is where you have a new kind of ideology that's really been mainstreamed, and that's kind of the ideology of conspiracy and misinformation. It always existed. In and of itself, it isn't new. But what's new is bizarre, destructive, and unhinged ideas, like Hillary Clinton is running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor, or that there are cannibals in the Democratic Party who want to eat children, and these other crazy things. Now, because of social media services generally, and Facebook in particular, QAnon and people saying George Soros is funding Antifa, which is so laughable, as if these Antifa people would ever take money from a multi-billionaire. I mean, it's just bananas, right? These anti-capitalists would take money from someone who exemplifies capitalism. But in this moment today, like, conspiracies now, Jack, are part of the conversation. Used to be you would ignore these crazy cranks, but Facebook's allowed all this stuff to seep into people algorithmically, invisibly, to find its way into your newsfeed, and suddenly it seems credible. So I worry a lot about the degradation of the public conversation, which has allowed extremism, which has allowed conspiracy, which has allowed misinformation to challenge and really impact the way we see basic concepts like truth and facts and science. And all of us lose. When we don't have a shared fact base, Jack, when we can't agree on the periodic table, for God's sakes, like I think all of us stand to lose.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to add this to that, Jack, because I think Jonathan's analysis is just brilliant. The fact of the matter is that that kind of situation is standard operating procedure in totalitarian regimes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
It's the method of the TASS news agency. You know, the old TASS news agency.
Yeah.
It's the method of Kim Jong-un, right? It's the method of, and I could name other totalitarian regimes at present or in history who controlled the people through organized, orchestrated campaigns of misinformation, division, fear, and hate. So what we see, and this is so troubling, is an assault on democracy at present, which is an attack on the voting system. There's fraud in the voting system. We can't have a fair election. Postal Service is going to mail-in ballots are ipso facto unreliable. We see it being utilized, and I think for it to live on the internet is one thing. For it to be echoed, affirmed, and amplified by legitimate public and elected officials, and therefore it creeps into mainstream legitimate news.
Yeah.
Is a problem for 21st century America. And I mean, Jonathan is right on in how he's framed this and characterized this. And look, it's enabled by social media, which one of the tragedies is social media, which has been seen as a real positive for people. Technology as an enhancer is now become for some an instrument of psychological warfare, an instrument of oppression, an instrument of propaganda. So it's good. And then it's also got a real bad side to it.
So I got to say, Jack, like Mark said something that's super important. Again, when I talk about conspiracy as an ideology now as part of this kind of a real issue we have to deal with, Mark said something that's really, really critical. It's not just that social media has allowed this stuff to flourish. You could always find weirdo mimeographed, on newsprint.
Flyers, yeah.
But what Mark said, it's like now we have elected officials who are parroting this instead of pushing it down. We have elected officials who are validating it instead of again, ejecting it from the space. And that is, remember the moment in 2008 when Barack Obama was running against John McCain. And at a town hall meeting when a woman stood up and said, I think Barack Obama is a Muslim or from Kenya, whatever lunatic thing it was.
And McCain said, no.
Yeah, no, ma'am, he's a good man. He's an American, like you and me. And that was really important because that exemplified, right there, what a responsible public servant, what a responsible elected official does. And now, I'm not breaking any news here when I say that our commander-in-chief certainly doesn't exhibit that kind of behavior, let alone other people, at the federal, state, and local level. So that's, to Mark's point, a big reason why we're in this moment of such turmoil right now.
Yeah, I take your point. I guess one of the questions I guess I'd have, and you're monitoring it so you know the level, because there have always been these kinds of conspiracy theories out there. Let's take QAnon. Is it now reaching a level of numbers of people who can be mobilized that really are material, that really could make a difference? Or is it still fringe? And it's a shame, many mainstream political leaders are not doing everything they can to call it out. But aside from that problem, has it gotten enough traction that you would see, Jonathan, that it could really have an impact in the election?
It is definitely having an impact, Jack. We know that to be true. There was a recent study that was released this week that said, whereas at one time 8% of Americans thought violence was a reasonable way to achieve political ends, the most recent stat that I saw, and I'll try to pull it up afterwards, was 33% in a new poll, which
Really?
is stunning.
Really?
And look, like, we are foolish to dismiss the potential impact. Timothy McVeigh, the guy who blew up the federal building, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1994, the largest act of domestic terror in the United States until 9/11, which is kind of foreign terror, but whatnot. Like, conspiracy theories about black helicopters in the government, trying to take over things. And flash forward to today, or last year, or 2 years ago, when the gentleman was arrested for sending mail bombs to George Soros and to other public figures because he'd read about that on the internet in the equivalent of like QAnon chat rooms. So I am very concerned about this, and I don't think we have that far to look. Frankly, there's a woman in Georgia running for Congress. She's on the GOP ticket. She's a QAnon candidate.
Yeah.
And we've had a number of other examples where, again, people in the House and the Senate have like quoted QAnon on the campaign trail. I mean, this is not, you might as well quote Mother Goose, for God's sake. I mean,
Mark, let me ask, Mark, are you concerned about election night, Mark? Are you concerned?
So
there's
a
lot of talk about how we might not know who the winner is. And
I'm concerned, but my message to voters is to not be intimidated. My message to voters is to not be provoked, to be fearful of voting, to not vote because of the rhetoric they're hearing, because I think there's a sinister conspiracy or sinister motive here to try to intimidate people into feeling their vote doesn't count or their vote doesn't matter, to try to suppress and push down voter turnout. So what I am sure of is that all of us in the civil rights community and those that are in the civil rights litigation community, as well as responsible elected officials around the country, secretaries of states and governors and mayors, are going to be vigilant in protecting the right to vote and ensuring that there are no issues or no problems. I believe there's just been an effort to discredit the process, which is unfair, which is designed to affect the outcome. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching and listening, we will not, and you should not be intimidated. You should not be snookered. You should not be fearful. You must choose your method of voting. You've got to make a personal plan, whether you're going to vote by mail, whether you're going to vote early, or whether you're going to vote on election day. I say pick the one that works for you.
Jonathan, what do you think about election night?
I think it might be election night, election week, election month, election quarter, but I do think what Mark said is right. Whether you want to mail in your ballot or show up at the polls, it's just never mattered more. And we can't allow, those, again, however you vote, like, it's not for me to tell you what ballot you pull or what party you should choose. But I think, the Constitution, it predicates upon, and this republic predicates upon people exercising their constitutional right to choose our leaders. And the whole system of government, that is literally the fuel that makes the engine of our democracy work. And if we don't have put fuel in the gas tank, don't be surprised if the engine, stops working. So I think participation always matters. I think it's easy to say it's never mattered more. I'll share a story. This week I got in trouble and I got attacked by some because the Jewish Democratic Council of America, which is like the Jewish Democrats group, released an ad that showed pictures of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust next to Donald Trump. And I criticized that because I said, look, this isn't the Shoah. People aren't being put in cattle cars. People aren't brought to slaughter, where they're going to be incinerated in ovens. I think it's going a bit far to make that kind of claim. But what Mark said a minute ago really matters. Like, the authoritarian tactics of this administration should concern all of us. And you don't need to say this is like the slaughter of 6 million Jews and 11 million people in Europe. There is a likeness to Chavez's Venezuela. There is a similarity to, again, Kim Jong-un's, some of the stuff that happened early on in North Korea. There is a similarity to what Erdogan in Turkey, or what in Hungary.
Philippines too.
Or yeah, like again and again, we can see these patterns where you degrade the democratic institutions, you delegitimize them, you debase the people involved, the press, the judiciary, NGOs, not judiciary, anyone involved in the courts, let alone the other party, right? And that pattern of behavior is why I think this election really matters. Like, people have got to show up and say, at the end of the day, I might not agree with the ideas of either party, but I believe in representative democracy. I believe in the US Constitution, and I want to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise this issue that we're seeing patterns, not just in the United States, but these are global trends. And I was talking with someone recently that started to connect the dots, for me anyway, on when there have in history been mass movements of people, immigration. We've oftentimes seen rise of nationalism and the same kind of political dynamic that we're experiencing around the world. So it's no coincidence that if you look at immigration in the United States and you looked at the line of how it fell off, but how it started to increase again in the 80s and 90s dramatically, or you look at what happened in Europe because of wars in the Middle East and the movement of people into Europe and the rise of right-wing groups there. So often, or even go back in history, by the way, Mark, James Carville once told me to read the book. It was about the Great Mississippi Flood of
1927. Which created a mass
movement of African Americans out of the South and into northern cities, and then began the Huey Longs and the populists, back then. It's fascinating to me that you can tie back to these movements when all of a sudden places are experiencing people who aren't like me, and they get fearful, and you get this kind of dynamic. Do you all see that?
I think
part of this.
I think it's implicit, and it's implicit and explicit into the change and what we see playing out in the public square. The notion that America is going to be populated or controlled or governed by people who are not like me, and the issue is for Americans to embrace the fact that the common identity of the nation is not an ethnic or religious identity. The common identity of the nation is an embrace of values, democracy, justice, opportunity, tolerance. That the commonality of the nation is around that, not around we worship the same, we look the same, we come from the same traditions. And in that, America remains one of these grand experiments in pluralism.
Yeah.
That once again, the country's being remade. We don't remember, and people don't talk about it, how controversial the 1960 election was. Because John Kennedy was a Catholic.
Right.
And because he was a Catholic, he was seen to represent the hopes and the aspirations of immigrants who, in many respects, were Irish and of Irish and Italian descent, primarily. A different, quote, American than some Americans had seen it. So it represented, a change in the direction of the country. We look back and say, really, was that controversial? It generated a tremendous amount of friction and debate and discussion. And so these notions, it's now, the change now involves the rising and the demographic transformation with people of color. And that does create, in some quarters of America, uncertainty and discomfort. The role of the President of the United States, to me, is to build bridges, not walls, to build understanding and dialogue and tolerance, not invective and finger pointing and division. And that's what we see today. And I think that the point of America is to understand what we are and who we are. And the country has constantly had to remake itself. Every generation's had to work to improve democracy. And we're at one of those hard crossroads now. And it's really a time when people have to decide where they stand.
Yeah. You know, I promised you all we'd end, and I know you've both got hard stops. I neglected to mention, but we're getting a number of questions coming across my screen. In the few minutes we have left, let me give you each a couple of quick questions. Jonathan, first, and this is one I know you get regularly. It's how do we and social media platforms balance our freedom of speech and civil liberties against hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation?
Super fast. Freedom of speech isn't the freedom to slander people. Freedom of expression isn't the freedom to incite violence against minorities. The idea that taking that stuff off of Facebook or any platform somehow constricts free speech is nonsensical. Just like it's nonsensical to say that to think you could go stand in Starbucks and scream at the patrons, go back to Mexico. If you stood in Starbucks and you screamed at the patrons or the staff to go back to whatever country and you yelled profanities, you know what Starbucks would do? They would throw you out. So all we're talking about here is Facebook and the other social media platforms using the same behaviors that every other business in the United States uses. That's it. And you can still say those things, say them somewhere else. And if you don't like the way the companies are perhaps, again, constraining hateful views, if you find that difficult to bear, you know what you can do? Turn the channel, open up a new browser, download a new application. There's infinite choices in our digital economy. And I think that we just need to realize that companies, regardless of what the law says, companies have a moral responsibility to their advertisers, to their users, to the society in which we live, to exercise some degree of accountability over the content that they push and promote. That's it.
Yeah. Mark, question for you, and Jonathan, hear your point on this too. How do you feel the confirmation process for the Supreme Court will affect the election? Will it? I mean, now
I think it
seems to have gone out of the news, but how will
well,
it?
I think it's going to stimulate, motivate, and encourage many of us, and I have to be clear on this, who believe that this seat should be filled by the next president to vote. The many of us who feel that the seat that President Obama nominated Merrick Garland to was a seat he had every legitimate justification to fill. And now that there's a hypocrisy, so while I think some on the right believe it's going to motivate their supporters, it is going to motivate people who believe that if you set down a principle in 2016 and you're not following it now, it's all about hypocrisy. And I don't think this nomination fight it's about the nominee. Yes, but it's about how this has been handled and the sheer hypocrisy of what is being done. It is a clear effort to hijack the court. So maybe it motivates on both sides people to vote, but it is going to raises questions about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court as a judicial body versus a political tribunal.
Yeah. Jonathan,
it's hard. I mean, I think that the way that the Republicans didn't allow Merrick Garland a hearing in 2016 was despicable. And I think it was dereliction of duty in terms of the role of the Senate and and the Constitution. I wish they applied the same standard. On the other hand, the president does have the right to appoint justices. I mean, I don't think that as an organization, ADL agrees with much of her jurisprudence, but the question really will be whether that's yet another reason people show up at the polls. And the other question is whether or not a body that allows people to serve well beyond the point of, their maximum cognitive capability.
Yeah.
There are not many jobs on the planet Earth other than the royal court in England or in Saudi Arabia, where someone can serve to the point where they are totally enfeebled, and yet the Supreme Court is right up there too. So yes. I think it merits this whole situation, stepping back and saying, is the court really constructed like a 21st century institution, and how can we improve it? Whether that means term limits, whether that means more members, whether that means some other potential strategies, I think that conversation needs to happen now.
And I think it will.
I hope so. We just have 2 minutes, so let's end on an uplifting note. Starting with you, Mark. What makes you most hopeful about politics in the country right now?
I mean, I'm an eternal optimist who believes and loves democracy, and I think the moral arc of the universe bends, as Dr. King says, towards justice and opportunity. And I believe that the people of goodwill, if they are not silent, if they are not spectators, we can architect a future a future for this nation that we can be proud of.
Jonathan, your final words.
I deeply believe America is the greatest country in the history of the human race. I think the possibilities here are endless. I think it's up to all of us. What was it that Ben Franklin said? Here's your republic if you can keep it. Now it's the time to keep our republic. So I hope everybody will show up in November and stay involved long after November to make sure, again, that we keep this republic.
Well said, gentlemen. Well, that's all the time.
Great to be with you, and great to be with you again, Jonathan.
Always good to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
You guys are great. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules for what I think has been just a fascinating conversation. And so we hope everyone tuned in. We'll continue to tune into our webinar series, and until then, stay safe and stay well. Thank you all.